All right, so back in '78, an aspiring 17-year-old writer called Tom Perrotta passed up tickets to see Bruce Springsteen at the Capitol Theater. Now, before you judge, he actually wanted to spend time with his girlfriend. Well, that very night, Tom's girl broke up with him, and Bruce played a legendary 5-hour concert that people still talk about today. So to recap, wow, that sucked. But safe to say things have picked up for Tom since then. One of his early books, Election, nailed high school politics, well, politics in general, and was made into a highly successful movie.
When the time came to cast our votes, I stood in line just like everyone else.
Hey, Tracy. Tracy Enid Flick. Thanks, Phil.
Then he wrote Little Children, a very dark story set in suburbia, made into a successful movie as well, uber creepy.
Oh my God, it's him. He's in the pool.
Tom received an Oscar nod for co-writing that screenplay. Not bad for a guy who grew up in suburban Jersey. Tom's latest novel is called The Leftovers, and it's got an intriguing premise. The title refers to those left behind. So after millions of people worldwide disappear in a single moment like the rapture, well, how do you carry on living after the catastrophe? More good news from Tom. He's actually working with HBO to turn the book into a series, and if that's not enough, Bruce is back on tour, and I'm sure coming soon to a town near Tom.
Please welcome Tom Perrotta. Good to see you, man. How are you?
Thanks for having me.
Of course, happy to have you. I love, okay, so The Leftovers has got this great idea, the idea of the agnostic's apocalypse, which I think is so incredible. I mean, this is for people who haven't had a chance to read it yet, just the premise of the book is all of a sudden people go missing.
That's right. So it's something like the Christian rapture, except the people who are taken are apparently a random sampling of humanity. So there's no religious framework through which people can understand what happened.
Why that? Why that idea of, because the rapture is such a strong part of the, you know, the Christian, especially evangelical Christian world. Why was that interesting to you?
Well, you know, I think the rapture and all apocalyptic thinking is meant to clarify things, right? Finally, there is the ultimate justice in the world. The good are rewarded, the bad, you know, get a, you know, a warning.
Justice,
yeah.
Or the warning,
they,
you're right.
They have a 7-year period to get it right.
3.5 of peace, 3.5 of war, or something like that.
Yeah, that's how it looks. And you know, in this case, the apocalypse comes, or something that resembles the apocalypse, but it just clouds the matter. And to me, that it just intensifies this basic human condition of not knowing. You know, it seems to me we'll never know, and that's the burden we live with.
You're not a religious guy, right?
No.
But certainly of late, this question has popped up in your head a lot. Why is that?
Well, you know, I think that when I look at it now, my last 2 novels, The Abstinence Teacher and The Leftovers, have dealt with Christianity and people struggling with their faith. And I realized that, you know, those 2 books were written after my father's death, and I think that, you know, though I identify myself as an agnostic, I think I've been very interested in the consolations offered by faith and in what people gain by having faith and the struggles people have to hold on to their faith. And both of those 2 books have really focused on that struggle and that journey for my characters.
I mean, in Little Children, man, that just, it was an interesting conversation, the idea of could you find sympathy in people who, in a sense, couldn't find it in themselves.
Well, I think, you know, to me, you know, all good stories have a moral question at their heart. And, you know, I've never been interested in sort of heroic human experience. I've been interested in everyday human experience and in the moral questions that sometimes just come with, you know, making the choices in our lives. You know, how do we love? Who do we love? Little Children really looked at the issue of sexual transgression throughout a whole community. You know, it had a pedophile, somebody who's, you know, the one guy who's beyond the pale, but then it had this adulterous couple, it had a man who, you know, had basically fallen into the world of internet porn, and it really was asking, like, you know, whose desires are legitimate, how do we live if our desires are deemed illegitimate, you know. So it is dealing with moral questions outside of a religious framework.
I thought what was really interesting about Little Children, too, is that in an era, certainly in the last 20 years, they've redefined Hollywood as what an anti-hero could be. But the anti-hero is never really that flawed, right? The flaws are things we tend to celebrate. But in your work, even with Election, I mean, the anti-heroes, they're anti. Yeah. There's more anti than hero in that. You know, when was the first time you came into that? You just came to realize that it was that's what interested you.
Well, you know, I've always been struck by this idea, particularly in Hollywood. They'll say, you know, your character needs to be likable. And when I'm writing a book, I never think my character needs to be likable. I think my character has to be interesting, and I think my character has to be understandable, or that it's my job as a writer to understand my character, to get inside his or her head. And to me, only flawed characters are interesting. I mean, unless you're talking about a superhero, you know, I just don't know why would a perfect character be interesting. All you could do with that character is ruin their lives. I mean, it's like the Book of Job.
Yeah, when you have a couple of books that become movies, and they become movies that people like, and you know, a movie like even Election was so, it helped kind of bring a resurgence, I thought, to a certain kind of indie filmmaking. Little Children, same idea. When you start writing books now, knowing what they could turn into, do you have to shut that voice off in your head?
Yeah, I absolutely do, and because it doesn't get me anywhere. I was writing a book called Joe College, and you know, people in Hollywood were saying, "Oh, everyone wants to read Joe College. You know, you're writing a college comedy. That's great." And they thought they knew, you know, they knew what a college comedy was. And the book that I was writing was comic, and it was about college, but it wasn't a college comedy, yeah. And it never got made as a movie. When I was writing Little Children, they're like, you know what, this is not a movie.
You're no kidding.
You know, the characters are unlikable. There's a pedophile. It's an ensemble cast. It's very dark. And I said, that's fine. You know, I'm writing my book. But then Todd Field, the filmmaker, said, I really love this book. I want to make it into a movie. And suddenly it became a movie. So there's just no sense trying to second guess or to try and engineer your work so that it might become a movie.
I know the good public relations answer is, you know, what you write your book and then let them turn it into a movie, they turn it into. But nobody who can really hunker down and bang out a book with the sort of pain that it takes to write a book, then to have it taken away and turned into something else. Even if you wrote the screenplay, what is that process like for you to watch your thing that oh no, God, there it goes?
It's a complicated one. Now, Election was not so complicated because it was an unpublished book, and you know, the movie gave it a life, and the movie was great. I think the movie is kind of amazing, and as you say, it was kind of an amazing surprise. Nobody knew what Reese Witherspoon could do. Mm-hmm. Very few people knew what Alexander Payne could do. Matthew Broderick showed a side of his acting nobody else had.
It was a bit of a resurgence for Matthew Broderick,
I think. It really was, and the movie's profile has only increased over, you know, the 10 years that it's been out. Little Children, of course, I was down in the trenches with Todd. We collaborated. I saw how certain choices got made, you know, what it meant to have you know, the studio was great, but they have their own agenda, their budgetary questions, there are all kinds of questions. So I saw how the sausage got made, and that was a little bit hard.
They say once you see the sausage get made, you'll never eat it again. So
I keep eating it.
You keep eating it. Leftovers, as a movie, I think it might even work better as a TV series.
That's how we're going to do it.
Is it really? Yeah?
Yeah, I'm developing it with HBO.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah. And are they going to take the proper story, or do they want an angle of it they want to develop?
Oh, you know, we're exploring that now. I mean, to me, the great thing about HBO and long-form TV is that you don't have to compress and cut and force a big narrative into a small box. You know, it has to fit into 2 hours, regardless of what it is. So we can let it breathe. Now, the book takes place 3 years after this rapture-like event. And I think that the show could start earlier, that a lot of stuff that's treated in flashback could be drawn out, and we could enter the story a little bit earlier.
How important is it for you to have some sort of element of just being subversive in what you write?
I don't think about it as subversive often. I think about it as counterintuitive. I want people to show people a new way of looking at something, or make them care about something they didn't think they would care about. If something is subversive, I think that just sort of comes out, I think, in the way that I treat the material.
It's good to see you, man. Thanks so much for being part.
Thanks
really
for having
appreciate
me.
it. Right on.
My pleasure.
Very talented Tom Perrotta. The book is called The Leftovers. We'll be right back.